Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT how to play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Renata Bruiser for patch 12.7. Meta has shifted towards the mid game after both the 12.6b patch and 12.7. With those changes, Renata Bruiser is back to being a viable, consistent composition because of how well it scales into the late game. We'll briefly cover why this composition is viable, plus the usual breakdown of core champions, items, augments, and a quick how-to for each stage of the game. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, let's talk about why Renata Bruiser is viable. As mentioned in our introduction, the main strength of this composition is its scaling. That alone doesn't paint enough of a picture, so let's expand on that idea. The meta has shifted away from most builds at Power Spike in Stage 3 and early into Stage 4, and instead focuses a lot on the end of the mid to late game. That's where the value of Renata, Bruisers, and Chemtech comes in. Bruisers are one of the best early game front lines with decent scaling into the mid game. Late game they are less flexible than say Bodyguard, but both Vi and Tahm Kench have decent scaling. Playing Bruisers basically ensures the player will be able to stabilize at level 7 to then transition to level 8 and begin finding those crucial late game units like Victor and Silco. With Bruisers comes Chemtech, as Zac is the ooze that glues it all together. Chemtech is also quite inexpensive into the late game, so it's a fantastic early game board to either win streak with or save a lot of health. Then comes Renata. Renata 1 isn't much to write home about, but as soon as you hit Renata 2 with 2 items, she can easily carry your board to level 9. To sum everything up, Bruiser and Chemtech help players tackle the early game while also providing a stable board into the mid game with the help of Renata. Renata 2 then carries the player to level 9, where Victor and Silco shine, providing the composition with fantastic late game scaling. Of course, there are downsides like not hitting Renata 2 early enough to capitalize on her strength or never finding 5-cost champions, but thankfully, the pace of the meta is slow enough that that usually isn't a major problem. Let's now switch over to talking about the core champions and traits for Renata Bruiser. There are a lot of ways to approach this composition because of how easily tweakable the board is based on what champions they have and other things like emblems and augments. The most basic version, being the easiest to play consistently, is going to be 4 Bruiser, 5 Chemtech, and 2 Scholar. That board, which does require level 9, uses the champions Renata, Victor, Warwick, Tryndamere, Zac, Tahm Kench, Vi, Sejuani, and Silco. With a Chemtech or Bruiser emblem, this is doable at level 8, but again, this is the easiest board to put together in the late game for this composition. But there are a lot of variations. That said, the core of the composition will always use Renata, Zac, and ideally Victor for Chemtech, with Vi being the second Bruiser. Tryndamere is often the third Chemtech instead of Victor simply because he's a 3-cost and holds on AD items well. In any case, those 4 champions are what you want to build off of. This can be done multiple ways, but generally requires an augment or emblem. For example, the 6 Bruiser variation can be done without an emblem, but it's significantly easier to fit everything in if you have one. This is the second most common variation of the build, since 5 Chemtech is not a necessity. The only reason 5 Chemtech is the baseline composition is due to the ease at which players can put it together. If you can instead play 6 Bruisers with Renata, Victor, and Silco, by all means play that because it will have better scaling. Then there's the variation using 7 Chemtech, which focuses more on Tryndamere and Warwick as the damage dealers. Or you can aim for 4 Scholars, a decent option given the recent buffs to Scholar. Another variation, more common than the 2 we just mentioned, sticks with 4 Bruiser and 3 Chemtech, but adds in Jace for 3 Enforcer. This version is particularly good if you have AD items for Jace. As you can see, there's plenty of ways to go about this composition. Even Warwick or Tryndamere reroll can technically transition into a Renata board, though it's a bit more difficult to do if you don't high roll. Overall, if you want the 2 simplest ways to build this composition, we recommend either 5 Chemtech, 4 Bruiser, 2 Scholar, or 6 Bruiser, 3 Chemtech, 2 Scholar. In contrast to the champions and traits, the core items are much simpler. Renata is the core of this composition, not necessarily because she's the best damage dealer, but because of her utility. Applying a DOT that does okay damage but also debuffs enemy units is the key to why Renata boards do well. That means the 2 most important items for Renata are Blue Buff and Morellonomicon. Blue Buff helps Renata cast often, which is important since you want the DOT damage to stack. More importantly, it helps spread the attack speed debuff consistently. Morellonomicon just makes sense on an AoE champion that casts often, with the added benefit of adding even more damage over time. The third item can be flexible, or you don't even need to have one for Renata and can instead focus on other champions. But if you do want a third item for Renata, it's either Gunblade for extra utility or Chalice to buff Victor. The rest of your items depend on what you're able to play on your board. Ideally, you want to have items for Victor and 1 or 2 defensive items for Vi or Tahm Kench. The best items for Victor are usually Shojin and AP items like JG, Deathcap, or extra damage like Giant Slayer. The important item to have for Victor will be a mana item like Shojin, as you want him casting often. Defensive items can be things like Redemption, Bramble, or Dragon's Claw, nothing too fancy. Thieves' Gloves are actually quite good in this composition on both Vi or Tahm Kench. Finally, there are variations using Tryndamere or Jace as carries, but for the most part, any AD items work well here. It's also worth keeping in mind that both Chemtech and Bruiser emblems are quite good in this comp. Having either usually makes slotting in late game champions easier, such as having Silco at level 8 instead of level 9, while maintaining your other synergies. The best part of this composition in regards to items is only needing 2 best-in-slot items for Renata. Every item beyond that can be flexible. Alright, it's Augment time. There are quite a lot of augments that do well with this comp. We'll get into specific ones, but first, the easiest way to know what augment is best to go with is what you need at that point in the game. On 1-4, this can be a lot of augments, but we recommend staying away from specific choices. Taking a Chemtech Heart on 1-4, for example, is a bit too specific when you may not even end up playing Renata. The 3-3 augment can be much more specific, with Crest and Emblem augments for Bruiser or Chemtech being decent options. Or more specific trait augments like Chemical Overload or Instant Injection. Shrug It Off can also be okay, though it doesn't scale too well into the late game. Point is, you should have more of an idea on 3-3 what direction your board is headed and can make more informed decision that way. On 4-6, you will for sure know what your composition is, or at least will in a few rounds. While late game pivots can happen, usually by 4-6, the majority of games, players will have a concrete idea of what their board is going to end up as. Due to that, you can get quite specific to what augment you take, whether it's an augment specific to your synergies or just something that helps in general. Those basics aside, let's get real specific. A quick list of viable traits specific to this composition are Makeshift Armor, Shrug It Off, Chemical Overload, Instant Injection, Chemtech Bruiser, Crest or Heart, Electrocharge, Battle Mage, Luden's Echo, Second Wind, Jeweled Lotus, and Band of Thieves. For niche choices, there's Featherweights if you want to play Warwick Reroll, Lifelong Learning if you want a crazy Scholar carry route, or high-end shopping to help with 2-starring your 5-cost champions. Having a lot of augment choices may seem overwhelming, but actually it's a blessing. It means you can get by with a wide array of augments and still do well, because at its core, this composition doesn't require anything specific to do well. That freedom may mean that you need to take a bit longer to decide on an augment, but you're also not punished for taking non-standard augments. Flexibility is the key. With that, we can move into the last bit of how to play, where we cover each stage of the game, starting with the early game. Component priority can go a lot of different ways, though starting off with an early tier can be quite helpful in securing a blue buff later. Otherwise, Rod, Belt, or Chain Vest are all fine to take, and each of them build into a number of playable early game items. In a perfect world, you'd be able to open with Umbrella Nomicon on a unit that spreads it well, like Echo, but that's not always going to happen. There's not much to do in Stage 1 and 2 beyond the standard openers. Look for a win streak if possible, otherwise aim to lose for a better economy and priority on the carousel. This composition does fare better if you have more health going into the mid-game, but it also stabilizes quite well at level 7, so it's not the end of the world to trade health for gold early. The only major decision in Stage 2 is determining if you want to do a reroll Chemtech board like Warwick or Twitch. They aren't nearly as consistent as they used to be, but it's worth keeping the option open if you're hitting a lot of the champions. Both of them can transition into Renata. Overall, it's best to stick with whatever opener you have, though Bruiser Chemtech is one of the better options since it makes for an easier transition later on. Mid-game begins at Stage 3, and again, the best way to play is standard. Level to 6, build up 50 gold, and wait to level to 7 in Stage 4. There are a few champions you can look for during this stage, such as Tryndamere and Zac, but again, whatever opening board you have that's functioning well is worth sticking to instead of pivoting into too specific of units. Stage 4 is where the game gets interesting, as you have to juggle rolling to stabilize while also saving your gold to level 8. Keep in mind that this board is at its best when you hit a Renata 2, so that's the overarching goal in Stage 4 and 5. Always be scouting to see who may be contesting, because that may mean you need to pivot. 4 Bruisers with a level 2 item holder and a few relevant synergies should be enough to hold down the fort at level 7. Ideally, you want to aim for level 8 between 4-2 and 5-1. Rule of thumb here is the same as ever. Level when you have at least 30 gold left over to roll with. After leveling, you can roll down to hit upgrades if you desperately need to stabilize, otherwise you can slow roll for a few levels. At this point, we can transition into late game, which is where you may end up low rolling, and finishing in the top 4 will be difficult. Low rolling for this composition means hitting Renata 2 late and not finding any of Victor, Tahm Kench, or Silco. That said, if you do hit Renata 2 and 1 or 2 of the 5 costs at level 8, great! As long as your front line is upgraded, you can begin the process of leveling to 9. Once again, the idea is the same in that ideally you want to hit level 9 with some amount of gold to roll. In a perfect world, it would be 30 or more, usually it means 20 or less. Try to aim for leveling after key rounds like the carousel or PvE so you can get the most out of whatever power spike those rounds gave you. Whenever you level to 9, the goal is to hit Victor 2, Silco 2, and Tahm Kench 2, or just whatever 5 costs you're utilizing. Then all you need to worry about is positioning. Try to always boost Victor with Silco, and usually Renata is the second champion receiving mana, though it can be other units if you don't need it on her. It is worth mentioning that this composition can do fine at level 8, but you may need to sacrifice one of your synergies because you really want both Victor and Silco in, as they are the late game insurance. Unfortunately, Renata 3 is not all that great, so we don't recommend spending gold towards that goal unless you have a lot of excess gold. All in all, this comp is easy to pivot into the late game and scales well, making it a great board to climb ranked with. And that's all for today's video, folks. As we said, Renata Bruiser can be a great composition to climb with, but the meta right now favors flexible play. Don't go out of your way to force this composition, and instead let it naturally happen, which should lead to a better result. Let us know in the comments section below which composition you'd like us to cover in our next How to Play video. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.